wade in, I'd like to go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for what I'm calling at the water cooler conversations in terms of, issues that we are all challenged by. Some see it as an opportunity to innovate and be creative while they're managing crisis. And for the past couple of weeks now, I think we're going into our third week now, I've just been reading a lot of articles, watching news stories, checking in social media, just to get a sense of where people are. And, at Focus St. Louis, that's what we try to do. Meet people where they are and educate and connect them in ways that they haven't been connected before, with the hopes that they'll go on to be catalysts for change in our community. So joining us on our panel today is Jason Hall, who's the co-founder and CEO of Arch to Park. Thank you, Jason, for raising your hand and saying, yes, I can be there at 11 o'clock. Also joining us is Anna Crosslin, who's the president and CEO of International Institute of St. Louis. I've been following you the minute this started, Anna, because you are very vocal, verbose, no holds bar in terms of what's going on in our community. You tell it like it is. And I thought it would be great for you to join us today and also give us perspective on what you're experiencing during these times. And last but not least is none other than Kelvin Westbrook. Kelvin Westbrook is the CEO of KRW Advisors. Every time he has joined us for one of our program days, we want more from Kelvin. And so, I thought he would also be a great person to join us. And for many years, he was the immediate past chair of BJC Healthcare, a role and that he served for a long time. So thank you again for joining us today. We have a significant number of our friends and alums that are listening to us just to learn about, where do we go from here? What are some of the lessons that you've learned as you've dove into this? I remember watching or listening to a public radio interview for the current mayor of Atlanta. And, they asked her what her playbook was when she came into office. And she paused and she said, playbook, what's that? There was none. I dove right in. And, it makes you kind of rethink all those Harvard Business Review articles, but we're living in a different time. You have to know how to plan, move forward, pivot as quickly as you can. So I'd like to encourage folks, if you have questions, please tee them up. I'll grab those questions and ask our panelists here. But, my first question to all of you is, how have your organizations pivoted within the past 3 weeks? And what decisions did you make? So we'll start with Hannah.
Hey. Well, one of the things that perhaps people aren't aware of is that we're considered one of the first responders from the point of view that there's a large constituency of non-native English speakers in the community that really rely on information, not just services, but information from the International Institute in languages other than English, but also in simplified terms and priorities so that they can better understand what's happening in the world around them, which is even more frightening for them. And so we had to respond, obviously, to the shelter-in-place decisions, both in St. Louis City, County, and in Illinois very quickly. But recognize that we could not cease services. We had to provide them differently. And so, becoming more technological quickly, which is sometimes a bit of a challenge for not-for-profits, especially social services, who think about, contact as being people to people, not technology-based in quite the same way, has been a real change for us. And we pivoted fast. We went to VPN. We started doing robocalls to our clients in non-native English languages, a variety of different kinds of things so that we could stay connected in a different way, but still stay connected. That was our primary goal.
Thank you, Anna. Kelvin.
Yes, Kelvin Westbrook here. Fortunately or unfortunately, I don't have a day-to-day job that's focused on any one organization. I serve on the boards of 4 public companies. And I would say, just taking up on a theme that Anna articulated, a lot of communications, a lot of effort to stay connected, A lot of engagement with management and encouraging them with respect not only what they're doing day to day, but focused on the longer term, the bigger picture. Reminding them that there's no reason to panic, even though sometimes we want to panic, that we are the leaders, and the tone at the top and our demeanor will be observed by all of our employees and other constituents. Everybody's looking to senior management for direction, trying to be thoughtful about that, staying as calm and as rational as possible, recognizing that there is tension and anxiety, and assurances about who we are, what we've always stood for, and living our values. Being open and flexible in our mindset is a theme that we've communicated broadly. And I would just pause right there and say it's been a lot of communication, different forms of communications, setting the cadence and expectations around communications, when employees and others should look to hear from us, recognizing that there's a lot of work that's being done, but making sure that people have the ability to turn to us on a frequent basis and hear what management and leadership is thinking. If they can't participate in conference calls and video conferences, we do have websites and webinars that they can plug into from wherever they are and listen and get words of encouragement and get a sense of what others are doing in this space. So I would stop right there and say that's a big part of the exercise in terms of what we at senior leadership is trying to do, trying to communicate, and focus short term, of course, but also looking at the bigger picture and long term.
Thank you. Kelvin, you have a unique perspective, and I'll come back to that. Being a board member of a number of public companies, I'm sure there's probably, a slight difference between the role of a board member at that level versus the role of a board member at a nonprofit level. But we'll come back to that. Let's go to Jason for his thoughts on the same question.
Yeah, well, I think like a lot of folks, it's kind of two worlds, because the economic development and business leadership groups had to come together, like many of us, right, and be a part of the response. But then there's also just our own organizations that we have to figure out how to adapt and maintain. And I don't know, I'm a Gen Xer, right? So I love in person. I like to be together and interact. So we had to adjust. We're a small team, but obviously recognizing and doing our part of the public health crisis, start working remote, and we've gone to just as a team, daily check-ins, at least as a small staff team to work on issues, and we do that by video, so we can see each other and interact, and then calls and videos in between. But on the more public-facing side, we're facing a public health crisis, a pandemic, and it's also has serious economic repercussions, both from the response that you have to deploy in order to defeat the pandemic, has immediate economic consequence. And then, of course, when the gears of the economy come to a grinding halt, as they have, around the globe, that's also going to be raising other issues that will surface soon around how do you work on a long-term economic recovery. But in the immediate, this pandemic, it doesn't know boundaries. It doesn't know rivers. It doesn't know states. It doesn't know countries. And so I think as a region, we are a region with a deep history. When we fought the pandemic at the turn of the last century, we're being very proactive in making bold decisions in public health. And I would say I have been impressed for a region where we oftentimes don't give ourselves enough credit for what we have to do to collaborate to make important decisions for the public. How this region came together. We had public leaders that deployed at a time when they were not getting as much support from the state, certainly not getting as much support out of the president, just to be candid, and had to work together in a collaborative way for the benefit of this region. and made and deployed some of the earliest stay-at-home orders that came on the heels of social distancing measures that had been in place prior to that. And we're some of the first in the country, quite frankly, first before many governors. And I think one is to recognize we had to operate differently. There's no time for line drawing exercises and that. The region just has to work together. Along those lines, you know, an organization, obviously, Kelvin's deep involvement with BJC Healthcare. I think the way they came together with their peers at Mercy and SSM and now St. Luke's, many would say is unprecedented. I mean, these are competitors in a marketplace, but to deal with the pandemic and to confront the pandemic in the best way for public health, they put health above profit. All of these organizations canceled, you know, elective surgeries weeks before this to free up capacity. They're working together to figure out how to share resources that are in limited supply so that it can meet health needs. That is tremendous. That is a new way of working together. And then finally, where the civic community has been supporting those two major bodies was standing up the St. Louis Metropolitan Pandemic Task Force. And that's a reminder that in a time of crisis, communication is leadership. We have got to get information out so that people can make important decisions, that they have access to facts, not misinformation, and we know what to do because this is new for all of us. And I would say that stands out in this country right now as a way that a region came together when this crisis was confronting us over the past month. And I just have rarely seen moments like this where this region banded together to do the right thing so quickly, so nimbly across a lot of jurisdictions has truly been impressive.
Thank you for that, Jason. I'd like to go back to Kelvin's question that I asked you in terms of your role on a public board, rather. And I'd like to, you know, for Hannah to weigh in too, in terms of what was the role of your board members as well, and what was that relationship like? So we'll start with Kelvin and then go to Anna.
Yeah, I think, you know, we immediately convened the board through electronic means. First, to get a situational update from each of our CEOs or senior management teams. And going through the process of what I'll call situational awareness, analysis, whatever you want to call it, to just get a sense of how we were being impacted. Making sure we reinforced the things that I mentioned before. Quickly got to a point where we knew this was going to be unprecedented, and lessons learned from other crises weren't necessarily going to hold us in good stead in the current environment. We went through a range of reactions, and people shared openly and candidly. Some people wanted to immediately go to expense cutting. How do we survive? And that's a natural reaction. A much more thoughtful reaction is, what resources do we have? Let's try to figure out what we're dealing with short-term and long-term. And let's not lose sight of the bigger picture. And so we had a lot of good conversations about that. We talked about decision-making, the process through which we would make decisions, and whether the framework that we've used in the past was something that needed to be altered or something that needed to be adhered to more closely. And we realized that our decision-making framework was a pretty good one, and that we shouldn't allow the emotions and the events of the day to cause us to lose track of that framework. Now, we also recognize that time was not necessarily our ally. And those who like to gather all the information before they make a decision, that luxury did not exist in the current environment. That we needed to look at the time frame and right-size our information gathering process to fit that time frame. I'd love to have 100% of the information. You're not going to get it. Right. You got to make decisions with less than 100% of the information. Also recognizing that sometimes out of adversity, if you're only focused on the negative and what's happening to you, you might miss opportunities to improve. You might miss opportunities to grow. So you have to keep your head on a swivel while you're paddling and reacting and doing the things that you need to do to protect. You also need to make sure that you're positioning yourselves and you're gathering the information that you need to gather to be in a better position after this passes, so that you can be stronger and better off for having gone through this process. So I would say that without digging too deep behind that, I'm exposed to telecom. I'm on the board of T-Mobile. And in the midst of this process, we closed one of the largest transactions in history. We
Wow.
ended up consummating the closing of our acquisition of Sprint. So for those of you who still have Sprint, welcome to the family. We're not going to change the name overnight, but we went into the marketplace. We closed that transaction, and our management team secured $20+ billion in financing in the last week or so to get that
Wow.
deal done. So there's still work that needs to be done. So you can't lose sight of the bigger picture. You can't be henny penny, the sky is falling, let's batten down the hatches and wait for the storm to pass. This is not that sort of environment. I'm also
Wow.
on the board of a large agribusiness concern. We still need to feed the world. And even though we have to practice social distancing and those things, the mail must still be delivered. The food must still be distributed. People need to eat. So ADM continues to be very active. Now we're doing it differently, but we still have our mission is still intact. And I'm on a board of a fairly large multifamily REIT. We own and operate large apartment buildings. So our people couldn't be necessarily on site as much as they'd like to be. We focused on what do our employees need? What do our residents / customers need? And in that instance, we implemented something that was unprecedented, recognizing that our residents, many of them are going to go through economic difficulties. We put in place a resident relief fund that people could apply to receive assistance to help them weather these difficult times. So each company is reacting differently, but
Right.
we're all focused on employees and their families, recognize that family situations are different. If you have young kids and they can no longer go to school, we have to be flexible in how we deal with people and allow them to react to their various circumstances. So I would just pause and say, you know, we're being humane, we're being value driven, we're not being short-sighted. We're trying to be as calm as we can. We're embracing the tensions. We're riding the rapids just like everybody else is riding the rapids. But if you've ever ridden the rapids, sometimes you know that the better course is not just to sit and wait for the rapids to calm down. Sometimes you have to stick your oar in those trouble, disturbing waters and pull with the current or against the current to navigate yourself to a better position. So I think we're doing all of that, Yemi, and I'm pleased to
That's
go
great.
deeper into any of that, but that's kind of been the mindset, and so far things are going pretty well.
Thank you for that. So in contrast, Anna, what has been your relationship with your board?
Well, as Kelvin was speaking, I was thinking actually about that question from a couple of directions, because there's my role as the CEO of the International Institute and my role with the board through that. And then also, I serve as chair of the board for another national not-for-profit that's based out of Seattle, Washington. And so I've been looking at it from a volunteer standpoint as well. And, you know, in terms of the International Institute, one of the things that some of the people in the community may or may not know is that we're 100 years old. And the organization is mid-sized, I guess it would be called. We have about 90 staff and a budget of in the 7 million annually. And so we're a well-established organization. We have been through emergencies and trauma, and when you're dealing with immigration in general and refugee resettlement, then it is a very, very fluctuating kind of an environment, particularly in the last 3 years anyway. And so you are constantly on your toes, looking to have to pivot depending on what the newest government change might be, what quite frankly the White House has decided at that point that they're going to do in a particular week with regards to immigration and admission to the United States. And so, you know, while the pandemic is obviously a a new angle to that. It is we've been in a situation already where we've had quite a bit of, it had to be very, very flexible already. And so for the board, at least, that's not a new kind of an environment for us. It's just a different take on a new environment. And so really, I've been at the organization now for going on 42 years. And, the most recent of the leadership team has been there for 10 years. And so really, it's a pretty stable environment from that point of view. And so the board has a lot of knowledge and confidence in the staff, and that we're looking out for the best interests of our clients and the organization in total. That's really important because, as I mentioned earlier, we really are a first responder organization with regards to a large client population in the community. And so we can't afford to sit back and say, now let's plan and figure out what we're going to do right now. We had to hit the ground within 12 hours, or in some cases quicker. One of our programs that we provide, in fact, that people know something about, which is refugee resettlement, is not as large right now as it was back in the 90s, for instance, when the Bosnians were all arriving. But still, since October of 2019, we've had 116 new refugees arrive in the community, including 40 who arrived in the second week of March. And so over and above the general communication challenges that one might have in the community dealing with people whose native language is not English, we had some very, very recent arrivals, including 40 people who had not been to English classes yet, who hadn't even been to the grocery store yet to be able to do shopping. And so we were challenged as an organization to try to be able to be doing initial community orientation at a time when we were not able to do so through the traditional methods. And so quickly pivoting and being able to develop those methods became a priority in terms of how we managed within the first 24 to 36 hours. Along with that, then, communication with the board became important. It's essential, but it's a slightly different kind of communication when you're in this kind of environment. And so obviously I shot off emails right away to the board, letting them know what was happening. We were going back and forth regularly in terms of communication, especially with executive committee members. And I have throughout this made a point every Friday before I stop for the day, I send the board an email. I let them know what's happened that week, where we are on various projects at that point that we're working on, priorities, etc. And so there's been that regular communication, but it's not been, but the board hasn't been called upon to have to make the decisions in the same way that they might in certain other kinds of environments. And they have the confidence at that point that we are, number one, thinking through and making the decisions that are necessary, and number two, that we will share those with them so that they're not in the dark about what's happening. And obviously, if it's a critical issue at that point, then we are going to the board to ask for their permission to do so. But for instance, we submitted a PPP application this past weekend. That's something that the employees of the agency put together based on what we saw to be the priorities, and moved ahead with it, and obviously kept them up to date about what was going on, but they were not the decision makers in terms of how that was all occurring. Now, thinking about it from the point of view of the organization that I chair out in Seattle, which is an interesting, different take on it, because the organization is actually about 3 times the size of the International Institute, and it's located in, 20 different cities or something like that. And yet, as an organization and an infrastructure, it has a smaller infrastructure in some ways. It's only existed for 30 years. There's been a lot of staff turnover in the last few years, and because of it, I've probably spent more time on the phone as the a chairperson of that board with that organization. And so it has to do in the end with depth and breadth of your team that's on the ground in day to day. And I think that's one of the points that I wanted to make, is that as a volunteer in the community, etc., you can have confidence in certain kinds of structures that help you to be able to provide that supplementary or a resource that's important to be able to keep an activity going, but you better know so that if you're actually involved in an organization that has less substance, you need to be there a lot more hands-on during this whole process.
Thank you for that. So we have a question from a member of our audience here, and he asks, because of the pandemic, our region is working collaboratively like never before. How can we keep this momentum going post this crisis? So I'm going to pivot to Jason to start us out responding to this question.
Yeah, it's a great question, because what I've been saying, to folks is talking on the phone and in meetings and stuff. If this is the way we need to come together at a time of crisis, just imagine what we could accomplish together if this was our normal every single day. And so I do think it should be an important reminder of the power of coming together and, at times just letting organizational or geographic boundaries go away. It's going to be critical. So I think we've got to remember what worked in a time of crisis and the power of working that way as a new norm. And I think we just got to keep saying it and saying it and saying it so that we can harness it. Because while a crisis, you have really acute challenges, the challenges that we faced before this crisis that we need to tackle around growth, around racial equity, those haven't gone away. And we need to act with the same level of urgency on those kinds of issues as we get past the public health pandemic, because we will defeat this. And we will have to confront a recovery. But I think Kelvin was, I thought, articulated this well, talking about the focus of long-term strategies, not losing sight of those priorities that we have as a community. Those are both our long-term challenges and opportunities. And man, let's work on them as vigorously as we would a crisis, so that St. Louis can reach its full potential.
Okay.
I would say if I could just tag onto that, I would say, depending on how you define crisis, I think there's common agreement that what we're experiencing with COVID-19, that is crisis.
Yep.
I would say when I was involved, and I guess I'm still involved with healthcare, that there's crisis around healthcare as well.
Yep.
And making sure people understand. I think COVID-19 was very widely communicated, embraced, and understood a lot quicker than the challenges surrounding other aspects of what's happening in this community. And I think people really don't understand that there's crisis afoot or at work or in existence in other parts of this community, whether it's around healthcare, whether it's gun violence. There is crisis. Yep. And if people are listening and opening their eyes, and I think part of what comes out of this is to demonstrate that we can do better. Our best comes out when we work together. And while we might be a loose confederation of 90 some odd municipalities, that when we come together, we can solve and address some of these crises that exist today, rather than wait until they become so overwhelming like COVID-19. Why should we wait until some of these crises overwhelm us? And so I would encourage us to take this spirit, take the lessons learned from what we're going through now and what we're going to go through. This is not going to be over like, okay, all of a sudden the wave has passed and it's business as usual. I would just say reading, which is what we all are doing during these times. What will this region look like? And I'm going to challenge us to say, we're going to need each other even more after the healthcare part of this has died down than we do today. The economic impact, Jason, as you were alluding to.
Yep.
It will not be business as usual.
No.
We will need each other even more. Restaurants and retail establishments. Life as we've known it is going to be different. And to think that we can go back and live business as usual, our neighbors, our communities, community to community will need each other even more tomorrow than they do today.
Yep. And I think we've seen that, I'm not frontline on, issues like education and social service delivery, but I think in the urgency of this pandemic, it does tend to amplify issues that already existed, right? We know that it is an unacceptable reality that zip code or race, can have where you're based or your race can have a huge impact on health disparities, right? And we're seeing that come out in this crisis, and that should be a reminder we have got to tackle those systemic challenges with vigor, so that when a crisis like this hits, the most vulnerable among us are not suffering the most. That should be unacceptable in the community. I've seen my eyes open with some of my collaborators, colleagues, and friends, that worked on education, right? It's one thing to make the tough decision to say schools are going to transition to online. Well, sometimes we can be subject to capture of our own privilege and just assume everybody has a laptop and everybody has an internet connection.
Right.
That does not exist. And I think we need to think about resiliency and equity and access, I hope in a different way, because, some are not getting the access that they need, and how packets get distributed if you don't have online access. This is a challenge, right? I mean, this was so tough for our schools. I can't even imagine what it was like to be a school administrator or a teacher right now. But I think we need to learn from this about the kind of access we need to plan for, that when something like this happens, that the impact is not disproportionately felt by the most vulnerable in this community. That's got to be unacceptable. And I hope we think through policy and the lessons learned and the vulnerabilities that become even more visible at a time of an urgent crisis like a pandemic.
Don't you think that part of what also has happened this time is that COVID has really not, it's affected everybody. This is not a case where, oh gee, if I live in St. Charles or I live in Jefferson County or whatever, then it really is not. This has affected everybody. And so from the point of view that you get people's attention the most when it's something that's personal, COVID has become personal in a way that other issues have struggled to be personal in quite the same way. And somehow, whether it's, in fact, I've been thinking in the last week or so about this whole question of the pandemic team, standing up there, and the mayor and the county exec in St. Charles all working together on the issue of being able to deal with COVID. And I've been thinking, my God, we couldn't get them to talk with one voice about city-county merger, about any of these kinds of issues, but here they are up here right now talking about COVID. So how do we make these issues more personal so that people get it at that point, that this is something that touches our lives? Yes, it's absolutely essential that we have better internet connections, that families have access to computers, etc. But still, people think, oh, but I come home and I have one, and so it doesn't seem it's one step removed at that point. Our challenge as a region is to figure out how to be able to make some of these issues more personal for everybody, because it's that whole thing of what's in it for me, how does it affect my life, etc., becomes the way in which you get that mass change that you need around some of these kinds of issues.
Thank you for those comments. So what leadership skills would you say are useful for this type of environment that people should be working on? I've heard you talk about being prepared, being ready to plan or execute a plan, but also pivoting. What leadership skills are essential for all leaders to familiarize or get training on? And who's leading? Who have you observed that's leading?
I'll just go ahead.
Kelvin.
No, go ahead, Jason. I'll pause.
I was just say, I think huge props, as I mentioned, to our healthcare leaders. I think the CEOs have been extraordinary. I think their chief clinical officers have been extraordinary in the level of collaboration I think the same can be said for the public health officials that have had to confront a surge. And as Anna was pointing out, our elected officials, for a group that we sometimes don't give enough credit for working together, had to come together to do coordinated social distancing policy, stay-at-home policy. These are hard decisions, and they all face very different electoral realities. The positive cases started showing up in some areas of our region before others, and so the urgency was sort of felt differently. And so I mean, man, I have just been nothing but impressed by that group of leaders, and we're blessed. I mean, I learned this, Dr. Alex Garza from SSM, who is the chief spokesperson on behalf of the pandemic task force. I mean, how blessed are we to have a former Obama administration official who fought H1N1 living right in our own community to tackle this, a colonel, in the Army Reserves, and just, so impressive. And, new leaders like Alex emerged that we may not have been as familiar with. And then the traits, that you were asking about as well, I do think it's a reminder of what Kelvin was saying earlier, be nimble. Sometimes you got to act and it's going to be an 80% solution. And then you figure out the next 5% the next day, right? We stood up this pandemic task force, the community did, and, providing the support. It's like, how do you get a live stream out to all these news outlets at the same time? And how do you do a socially distanced press conference and all these kind of new issues that we hadn't faced? So being nimble, but not standing still is critical. And then I also think listening, it's we got to communicate, but I think also listening, because sometimes we forget things or we assume things because information is flowing so quickly. And I've had to do that, especially in the morning and at the end of the day. What have I really learned? What did I hear? Am I processing it the right way? And sort of give myself that time and space to process this.
Okay. Thank
So
you,
I would
Kelvin.
weigh in. I would say, putting aside the traditional things that come to mind when we think about leadership, I would say in this current environment and in the future state, being comfortable with change, disruption, transition, being comfortable making decisions in a state of ambiguity, where you're not going to have all the information, where circumstances are changing. We've often thought about disruption as a result of innovation and technology. Well, this wasn't technology, and this wasn't, maybe it's a form of innovation because it's the new coronavirus, but it's not what we thought about in terms of what sort of change should we anticipate. How is our business likely to be disrupted? So a skill set or personality or demeanor that has the ability to remain confident, comfortable, and courageous under fire. Because I think we're going to be under fire for a long time. I think I may have shared with some of you at a different time. I remember being in a group with Colin Powell. And Colin Powell said, I'd love to have more information. I always would like to have more information, but I realize that circumstances will not ever permit me to have as much information as I'd like. And if you're not comfortable making decisions when you have less than 50% of the information that you'd like to have, then this new environment may not be well suited for you. You might have been a good leader when things were calm and when things were foreseeable, but when S hits the fan and you can't have all the information, are you the sort of person who can make a decision and communicate it to the troops or your constituents, your employees, with a level of confidence that gets them to support your decision, when you know in your heart of hearts you're making a decision based on only 50% of the information you'd like? And he said in his situation, he said, if you told me I had an hour before the enemy is going to be here, then I have to gather as much information as I can in 50 minutes, knowing that it's going to take me 10 minutes to execute. Then I have 45 minutes to gather up as much information as I can, 5 minutes to make the decision, and 10 minutes to implement. That's the sort of leadership the current times are going to demand. Someone who has a higher tolerance and a willingness to adapt. Someone who embraces the diversity that Anna and Jason were talking about, recognizing that solutions are going to come from different parts of the community, and that our best decisions are likely to be made when there's a diversity of perspectives around the table. Somebody who can communicate candidly about what we need to do, and not communicate to continue to maintain an environment where everybody is comfortable. There's a level of discomfort that's going to be generated by strong leadership. But at the same time, that leadership needs to speak very candidly, be very transparent, at the same time, maintaining a disposition of confidence that on the other side of whatever we're going through, we're going to all be better off. That leader also needs to be able to paint the picture, to articulate the vision that's going to embrace us and engage us. What does that carrot look like? What does that future state look like that should cause us all to rally around this particular personality and take the next hill to do the tireless work on a day-to-day basis? What is that vision? So you got to be a visionary at the same time. So I'll pause there, but that's kind of my reaction to what we're going through.
That is so true. Anna, any thoughts on that question? Who's leading?
Well,
and what are the leadership skills?
They have both articulated really great portions of it, and I don't want to be redundant. I do think that listening is incredibly important in the whole process. A leader has to listen because you select the best parts then of many different options, as opposed to simply going with one if you're willing to listen. But the only thing I'd really add to it is that a true leader needs to be empathetic. They have to be able to transmit humanity, and the fact that they see more than just the dollars and cents and the bottom line, but that they share in feelings of loss and the grief, in fact, that may come with loss when this kind of a situation occurs. I mean, the truth of the matter, if the world is just not going to look like or be the way it used to be when we come out of this. It may be as minor to some people as a restaurant, their favorite restaurant that doesn't open up again, or it may be that they lose family members in the middle of coronavirus. Whatever it is, the world is going to change, and to the degree that we can help people we know, people with whom we work, understand that. And let them grieve, but then offer them the opportunities that are important and direction so that they understand that out of these changes, something new and eventually better will come. That's part of being a leader is to be that representative and to help that action take place.
Very good.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah, very well said. Final question for all three of you is, throughout this pandemic, what do you think other regions can learn from St. Louis? Are we a national model in some way, shape, or form with this? We're kind of the hotspot for everything in this country. Anna, you want to go first?
Oh, I get to go first.
Yes.
You know, I've thought about this, and I think that one of the challenges to answering a question like this is that every community shows a different side of leadership. You know, what we face in St. Louis is very different than New York City, has been very different from what was going on in Wuhan, which is, you know, yada, yada, yada. And so it's hard to say, you know, which is more important than another. What I do think I was inspired by, and I mentioned this earlier, is this, the leaders coming together as a pandemic team at that point and speaking with a single voice about some of these issues. When we look at how long it took for instance, for our governor to declare, shelter in place for the state of Missouri, and yet the fact that we stood up early as a group and said, this is what we're going to do for the good of the region. To me, that is incredibly inspirational and something I wasn't seeing other places. You had cities all over the country, like the donut hole. Something was happening in the hole, but not in the area around it, etc. We as a region acted like a region, and that was really inspirational to me.
Thank you. Jason?
I would like to think that what Anna just described would continue to exist throughout this crisis and change the way we engage with one another on an ongoing basis. I think if we can show, here's where we were before, here's how we came together during, and this is the way to play going forward, that there's a better playbook that we develop that we can then show others how you can take a regional approach to some of our challenges. So I think Anna is right that has happened, that is happening, but can we sustain that? If it can't be sustained, I think we've lost an opportunity. So if we can capture the opportunity and sustain that, that'll be a great thing to share with the rest of the world.
Thank you.
Yeah, I do think it's a model, because I think if, Bruce Katz and others have written about this, local cities and regions are kind of where the interesting problem solving is occurring right now. If you would have gone back, 40 years ago, that might have been predominantly at the national or federal government levels. And I think that's really what he calls the new localism. And we got to get that right for St. Louis to reach its full potential. And I think as Kelvin was pointing out, this is an example of what it can look like. This is that future state. Can we replicate? It's hard, it's messy, there's disagreements, but at the end of the day, leaders, as Kelvin said, make bold decisions and articulate a view. It certainly had to be hard. The mayor and the county executive issued the first stay-at-home orders as local leaders on the Missouri side of the St. Louis Metro, and that had to be tough. But now, where we're at, those were the right decisions to save lives and to slow the transmission. Looking ahead, just as a little bit of a optimism, there will be lots of community challenges, but obviously economic recovery will come in sharp focus as soon as we defeat the pandemic. And, Otis Williams, who I work a lot with, and I were speaking yesterday, Rodney Krim, people like that we work a lot in the economic development. To me, there's actually been a fairly stable set of relationships for people that do the frontline job creation lane in the community. And I think just taking the early tenor of those conversations is, let's do that. This is exactly what we want to do for the recovery. And how do we do it even better than we did in 2009? And how do we pivot out of what the healthcare leaders and public officials did to an ecosystem of job creation, so that we just keep that level of collaboration where the community interest is above any organization? I'm encouraged. I mean, that's how we're talking about it already. And, that's just in the planning before, you can really launch the full-on recovery efforts.
No truer words were said by all of you. I'm encouraged by what you say, Jason, by what you share in terms of visioning, Kelvin, by what you've shared with us in terms of accountability, transparency. Communication is important. You can never have enough of that at these times. And also just listening and being compassionate. A friend of mine that I hadn't spoken to in about 8 years reached out to me. And, it was almost like we continued the conversation where we left off. And, this has been an opportunity for a lot of people to reconnect with, a lot of different folks across sectors, and to also start to think about collaboration in different ways that's forward moving, but also, I want to go back to what Kelvin said, having a vision. Because what's the often referred to where the people have no vision, they perish. But I'm glad with our conversation today. I hope our participants have had an opportunity to just learn about how we are all challenged by this, but also looking at it as an opportunity to innovate and to be creative. And, learn where your blind spots are and where you need to shore up and who else you need to have at your leadership table, at your community table. And good things are happening. Thanks for, the tip on Sprint there. I was wondering when, if ever, that was going to happen. So
Took 2 years.
business,
It took 2 years to get it done, but we got it done in the worst of economic times, right? But we got it
yes,
done.
yeah.
Level of commitment to the mission.
Yes, and that is so true. At the end of the day, you have to look at what is mission critical for your employees as well as your company. So I want to thank you all again for joining us this is going to be a first in a series. And over the next couple of weeks, please let us know what other topics you'd like for us to address, because we'll meet you there. We have leaders across sectors in our region that are willing to come and be authentic and share their failures as well as their success. And our next one is going to be April 21st, and we're going to be taking a look at higher education. What are they doing? There's been a lot of reports on, the cuts by the governor. What does this mean for students that are graduating or for students that are entering? So stay tuned. Please let us hear from you. And thank you, everyone, for joining us at Focus Forward at the Water Cooler. Have a great day. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
All right. Bye.